My name is Christian Wirth. I'm co-chairing this session. I'm a plant ecologist by training. I'm also a speaker of the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research. So I hope that you can understand this well. But I shall say that I'm very impressed. She is really operating outside the ivory tower of science. I would like just to give one quote. She said, "We do not have the luxury to do science without implementation and vice versa." So, Vassiliki, I'm really looking forward to your talk. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. So here is the title of my presentation about where to see wind farms. This is a really hot topic. And introduction. We know that we are facing an unprecedented energy crisis. We know that we have the European Green Deal milestone, very nice, about the obligation for gas emission reduction by over 55% by 2030. And then we have the Repower EU plan that is going to amend the renewable energy directives. And as also indicated in the previous session, all renewable energy projects might be called of overriding public interest, and we are going to have go-to areas for a very fast development without really accounting for environmental impacts, because we need to have a very fast development. And this is, of course, it's very obvious that we have an unprecedented conflict with biodiversity conservation, because one could say, isn't biodiversity maintenance also of overriding public interest? Shouldn't we design non-go-to areas for nature protection? The wind energy that we're going to talk about is blooming, and these investors they anticipated a six-fold increase of the wind capacity the next years to build all this infrastructure all over Europe. So the main question is how much nature are we going to sacrifice to address the energy crisis? Because wind farm projects they are good, they help us a lot. They contribute to cut emission reduction as a main race to this target, but they also need large tracts of land. And here is, in this scheme, here is the conflict. So we cannot really not lose ecosystems since they function as carbon sinks. And on the other side, in the same side of the problem, we have roads, because wind farms means more access roads, more artificial land expansion in wilderness areas. And roads, unfortunately, it's very, very rich in log literature that proves that they are linked to all the five major threats for biodiversity conservation, as you can see here, and they can really threaten ecosystem services, wildlife, even human health. And the problem is underestimated. Here there are some data. For instance, Europe is the most fragmented continent of the world, as you can see here in this very nice map. Um, Roads are going to really to increase by millions, 25 millions by 2050. And it's not really an exaggeration to say that road expansion is the epitome of the human destructive force to nature, especially when they penetrate the wilderness and they really transfer human footprint in the most wild and natural in the nature. So this is something we should address, and it is not addressed in the biodiversity strategy and European policy so far. I'm going to shift to the research. I'm going to try to present you four papers in the remaining 10 minutes. So the first main paper, Where to Seek Wind Farms, this is a paper about the national planning published in 2021. The method was that we consider the Natura 2000 as a surrogate for higher biodiversity, ecological important areas. We also used a very interesting index that is the Landscape Fragmentation Index provided by the European Environmental Agency, as you can see in the map, because the white areas means wilderness areas, low fragmentation areas. So we consider also this index in our analysis, in our methodological analysis. And we said that, let's see, we consider Natura 2000 in areas with low fragmentation index as an exclusion zone. All the other area is going to be an investment zone, a potential investment zone where investment should be prioritized. And of course, we did not exclude the currently operated wind farms, but all the new applications should be bid exclusively in the investment zone. And we also cross-check the scenario with a series of parameters. Let's move to the results. In 2020, that we had the data for this paper, we had about 44% of the national targets met already. And if we consider the business as usual scenario, that means that if all applications for wind farms in the country should be built, that would be that we should build 11 times more wind farms, overpassing the national target. Here is the number, and here's the national target, by about 5-6 times. And even worse, if we talk about Natura 2000 area, uh, it is almost invisible in the country because we expect to have 17.5 times more wind farms, wind turbines, I'm sorry, in the Natura 2000. And here comes our sustainable scenario by the exclusion zone and the investment zone that really, by locating wind farms in the most fragmented land outside of Natura 2000, we can largely and safely meet and overpass the national target by 2030. Here is the scenario. You can see that here is the green zone is the exclusion zone, blue zone is the potential investment zone. As you can see here, it has significant benefits for biodiversity. We have cross-checked it in the paper. One could ask, what about the wind energy speed? The speed. It is significantly lower in the blue zone, but of the order of 4%, so not really much, it's not a problem. And about land resources, we also have checked that by meeting all our energy targets, we should have 1.22% of land resources in the blue zone. So really there is land in the human altered landscapes. And finally, what about land repower and the new plan of the Greek government? We don't know what is going to be the new target of the country, but the main methods start to build in the blue zone and from the most fragmented areas remains. Um, Business sector is not happy, of course, out of this scenario. It was a scenario that it was supported by several scientific societies in the country and by 15 NGOs and so on, discussed in the Greek parliament, this paper. But I think that they are wrong to oppose this because the scenario might attenuate the fierce social opposition we currently have in the country because we have landscape value laws and many people they react all over in the country and they oppose in general the wind energy sector because they lose also the potential for the touristic development as Greece is a touristic country and what is important for tourism is the landscape value. So we think that the scenario can have also a social input to accelerate investment in safer grounds with greater social acceptance. So this is about the first paper. About the second one, where to seed wind farms. This is something we're currently working on, and I just present you a published data. You can see here the red polygon is a future wind farm. Okay, and here is the roads that they are constructing, the new artificial land. So in practice, what we did is that we consider all the operating wind farms now in the country. We took a subset of 1/3 of them, and we digitized all artificial land inside and outside the polygon. And let's move to the results out of it. The first question, how much land is consumed? Of course, the majority, 74%, is consumed inside the installation polygon. But what is interesting is that the new access road construction is the major contributor for the new land take outside the polygons, you can see here. And many kilometers of the new access roads are going to be built, and this is not really nice. And we found that the land use intensity in Greece, that means the square kilometer, the surface of new artificial land created per megawatt hour, is triple, is 3 times more than the global average in the country. And this is quite scary. Why? The next question is about which factor affects really land use intensity. Is that, of course, more artificial land is created within the installation polygons of wind farms by planting wind farms with more wind turbines, greater rotor diameter. This is quite expected. But the interesting result is that this is connected with the areas with steeper slopes and also in areas without nearby infrastructure. Similar results for roads. More kilometers of access roads, new roads or widening the network, have to be constructed when sitting wind farms in areas with steeper slopes. And the main results out of the second paper is that land take is not minimal, it's not trivial, it can be a substantial in mountainous countries with harsh topography such as Greece or other countries in Europe. And we should select sites nearby existing road network in milder slopes to minimize the impacts of wind farm on land take. And so mountainous areas of steep slopes and mountain tops should be no-go to areas. This is what this paper shows. And then I moved to a third paper that it's quite a success. So I'm very happy to report this paper. It's about the Greek road use policy. We have this problem and this paradox. On one side, we have the European Union that wishes to spend billions of euros per year for the restoration targets to actively restore nature and plant billions of trees and so on. We all know the restoration targets of the biodiversity strategy. And on the other side, really, we let pristine nature vulnerable to new roads and development projects. At least this is the case in my country, in Greece, but I know that it's also the case in Spain and in other biodiversity-rich countries. So how to solve this paradox? We have mapped roadless areas of the country, that is really pristine areas, and we are very happy to report that we have the first Greek roadless government and policy legislation in Europe. And it was the project Uncharted Mountains that was announced in COP26 by our Prime Minister. And road construction and any artificial land expansion is banned in 7 roadless mountains for a start. And you can check here that some very important points like halt expansion of artificial land and minimize fragmentation is inserted for the first time in Greek legislation and hopefully for also other national legislation in Europe. Sorry, I don't know why. Okay, so the fourth paper, and I try to finish, is that we have mapped the whole roadless areas for the whole country. I'm not going to enter in the methodological details, just to say that any land patch over 1 square kilometer that is at least 1 kilometer away from the nearest road, this is called an RCA, roadless core area. And if we consider also the buffer zone, this is called the roadless area. So the results are quite impressive as well. Here is the national roadless map of Greece. We do have intact nature still left in the country. That accounts about 6%. We have 389 roadless areas, as you can see. 1/3 of the islands is roadless, and if we consider also the very small islets, it's about 97%. So, last slides, what are the take-home messages? First, I would say that all the renewables projects are very much needed. We should proceed really fast, but also nature is of high value, so they are both of overriding public interest. We need an adequate spatial planning to happen, and we do not have the luxury or even the moral right to sacrifice nature and our carbon sinks to overcome our short-term problems. The second is that we should see them as indicated in human-added landscape in proximity with existing roads and really ban them from wilderness areas. The local setting, we should choose site with milder topography and in proximity with existing infrastructure. The fourth message is the need for a roadless policy. So inside the go-to areas, we should have also equally to design non-go-to areas, and roadless areas are a very good tool for this direction. And finally, it's time to think about a land take threshold and the land take policy to minimize land take in the European Union, and to say that all material is uploaded into these 2 websites of our lab. So we'll be glad if you come and visit the websites. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vassiliki, for this really interesting and also slightly worrying talk that you just gave. And also thank you very much for keeping the time. I would like to move on directly to the next talk, which is also in the realm of wind farms. It's my pleasure to introduce Finn Rehling. He is an early career scientist from the University of Marburg, and he's working in the conservation group of Nina Favik. So he's very strongly interested in the role of biodiversity for ecosystem functioning. And he is also a passionate conservation biologist who has worked in the national park Białowieża in old growth forests. And also his talk now deals with wind farms in forests and their impacts. So Finn, I'm really looking forward to your talk, and the floor is yours now.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Finn Rehling, and I'm excited to be here today. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present and discuss the findings of our latest project on wind turbines on animals in forest ecosystems. Yeah, wind energy, as you've heard, is among the major alternatives to promote a change from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. And to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, wind energy will need to supply roughly 25 to 40% of global energy. So if we follow green scenarios. So we have a huge demand for wind energy. In the past, wind turbines have been mostly constructed in open areas and in marine environments. However, the number of construction sites within open areas are decreasing, and more wind turbines have been recently placed in forests. And this recent development is relevant for nature conservation because we are not really aware of what's going on in forests when wind turbines are planted there. And the construction of wind turbines could put biodiversity in forest ecosystems at risk. And usually we differentiate between 4 types of effects of wind turbines on biodiversity. So there's the direct loss that is related to the construction of the sites. Wind turbines have been shown to block flyways of migratory birds, of migrating animals in general. Animals collide with wind turbines, but not only collide, also just the passing of rotors can lead to the barotrauma in bats and also cause their mortality. And last but not least, animals can be indirectly affected by wind turbines through noises or shadowing or flickering, shadowing, and this can lead to the displacement of animals. And if animals are then forced to migrate from benign to potentially harsh environments with more competitors or with fewer resources, wind turbines might indirectly lead to populations declines in displaced animals. To reduce these potential conflicts between nature conservation and climate change mitigations, of course, we have some measures. Countries in the EU have set themselves the goal to minimize these effects, and to do so, environmental impact assessments need to be carried out before wind turbine can be constructed. This shall ensure that sites or construction sites are limited to forests of low priority for nature conservation. So if we look at these forests here, we would quite easily see that it should be the right one, because these forests, so we search for rather small, fragmented, degraded, or structurally poor forests that are not located along migratory routes, and forests that lack endangered or sensitive species. So to test how this will look in the forest environment, we just very easily, or in a simplified version, expected that the effect is negative on forest ecosystems. So during these environmental impact assessments, small bird species are usually of minor importance. So we were interested in finding out how wind turbines affect these animals. Based on studies in open habitats and marine environments, we will expect that the overall effect will be negative, but because there are species-dependent differences in how species respond to the wind turbine, we will expect, at the level of species, different avoidance behavior. And we expected that these relationships will also depend on characteristics of wind turbines. So with increasing or decreasing distance to the wind turbine, the bird species will be differently affected by it, and the size of the rotor or the size of the wind turbine, which is then related to noise or some other factors will also differently affect bird species. To test these hypotheses, we did a huge monitoring effort in Germany. We used an impact gradient design and at 24 study sites in Hesse in Germany, and conducted point counts with a radius of 20 meter in at least 24 sites. And then these point counts were located at different distances to the wind turbine. To correct for differences in the forest environment among study sites, we also recorded forest characteristics that are known to influence bird communities, such as the proportion of coniferous plants, the vertical vegetation heterogeneity, which is the measure for the structural richness of a forest, and the forest stand age. And overall, I would say we were quite successful. So we counted 860 we conducted 860 point counts, counted 2,231 bird individuals from 45 bird species. So, and if I say we, I mean Anna, because she did this bird monitoring, and the credit should go out to her. And what we find is that the forest environment had a very strong effect on the bird communities. This is not so super surprisingly, but for me, it was surprising nevertheless, because the effects were quite strong. So we had an increase in, for example, the bird abundance by 60% in mixed forests, by over 60% in structurally rich forests, and by over 60% in rather old forests. And now let's check for the results of the wind turbines. Yeah, and apparently there was no effect of the distance of a point count to the wind turbine on the bird communities. So there was no effect on bird abundance. But in line with our expectation, larger wind turbines, so larger rotors, led or were related to a decrease in the bird abundance among forests. So because now these were the total number of birds, at the species level, the relationship can be different. But here we didn't find, we partially found evidence for this. So there was no change again in the bird composition or in the occurrence of birds with the distance to wind turbines, but with increasing rotor diameter of wind turbines, the bird community changed. And to just shortly put it, 4 especially frequent bird species decreased in their occurrence, and as a consequence, the forest bird community overall became more heterogeneous, and especially Cocothrausus, so the hawfinch, increased in bird occurrence. To shortly summarize these results, so we found that the diversity of birds were much larger in old, structure-rich, and mixed forests, so even when wind turbines were constructed there. In addition, we show that the usually small common birds in managed forests are weakly affected by wind turbines in their proximity. This might be due to the reason that they are locally not very wary of wind turbines and rather fly at low heights. So, however, the size of wind turbines was negatively related to bird diversity, bird abundance, and led to changes in the community composition of birds. So if then forest birds are displaced to harsh environments, wind turbines might indirectly lead to declines of the displaced animals. But please note, in our case, the size of wind turbines was correlated to other features of the wind turbines. So the size of wind turbines among study sites was highly correlated to the number of wind turbines and to the overall height and to the age of wind turbines at these sites. So we couldn't really decipher whether it's really only due to the size of a rotor or to the number of wind turbines. So this would be a very nice research avenue for our future projects. Overall, wind turbines' effects on birds in managed forests are much smaller than the effects of the forest structure. And interestingly, we could show the same pattern for bats in a recent project. And this has been conducted by Yuya, who looked at the bat activity in the same study sites and also found that forest characteristics are more important for bat activity than wind turbine characteristics, although wind turbines also negatively affect bats. In fact, forest bat specialists even decreased locally, so with decreasing distance to the wind turbines. So if you are interested in those results, please check out her study. So what are then the implications for constructing wind turbines in forests? So similar to wind turbine effects in open and marine environments, we can show that negative effects of wind turbines also exist in forest ecosystems. So it doesn't really matter where you put them, they will always, or most likely always, lead to a displacement of animals. To ensure that, but these effects are rather small, so that to ensure that these relatively small effects will not become locally ecologically significant at larger scales. So imagine in Germany, for example, we now have 30,000 wind turbines constructed throughout Germany, and this number shall be doubled by 2050. So we will have 60,000 wind turbines constructed. So this is really a huge number. And even then, large effect sizes can matter at the national scale, for example. So we recommend to further minimize the impact of wind turbines on forest animals, and we see two potential ways forward. First, compensatory measures for constructing wind turbines should account for indirect effects of wind turbines on the environment. And secondly, as Professor Kati already said, that the spatial planning of wind turbines in forests is key. So we should prioritize forests that are most impacted by humans. And these are small, fragmented, highly disturbed, managed monocultures. And as we showed, for example, the forest stand age or the structural richness or the community tree composition of forests can hint towards forests that should be prioritized. So then hopefully in future we will find a way of how to better align climate goals and biodiversity goals in future. So thank you very much for your attention. And with these words, I would like to thank my colleagues, Anna, Julia, Nina, and Franziska for their huge effort that led to the success of this project, and the FEDA for organizing this event, and the audience for their attention. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your very nice talk. I was just saying that it was a very nice study, very nice contribution to this conflict. So I fully agree with your findings, of course. And let me introduce our next speaker. So we shift to the freshwater resources that are extremely important. So Jürgen Geist is a chair professor of aquatic system biology in the Technical University of Munich, Germany, and director of the Limnological Research Station in Iffendorf. So he works a lot. He has a long-standing experience on understanding how aquatic ecosystems they are functioning, what are the stressors. So we're going to have a very interesting talk about the stressor, the new projects on the freshwater ecosystems. So Jürgen, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Well, we will now shift gears from wind to water, and we will look into the effects of hydropower use on freshwater biodiversity. And well, throughout this conference, we've already heard about the declines of biodiversity throughout different habitat types and ecosystems. And at this point, I would like to stress that the decline of biodiversity in freshwater ecosystems is sometimes overlooked, but is particularly strong. Most often it goes unnoticed because things happen under the water surface, and quite often it is also that many of the aquatic groups are not as prominent as birds or mammals, but there is at least some attention towards fish populations and fish population trends, where we see the same which we also see in many other aquatic species. And this is an example from Bavaria in Germany, where we did an investigation where we had access to long-term data on fish population assessments carried out by the state authorities. And as you will see here, well, there has been a severe loss of species already until the 1990s. So 21 out of the 69 species in these recordings actually, were completely lost from these areas. At the same time, we see strong decreases in the spatial distribution. So for 27 fish species, there's been a decline to less than 50% of the original distribution range. And this mostly affects the current loving, the rheophilic species, and the fish species that depend on gravel habitat for their spawning. Well, you could say, well, there's been a slight increasing trend in terms of diversity indices and in terms of species numbers in more recent years, but this is mostly due to the establishment of non-native species in those areas. So this is not necessarily a positive thing. And when we look at the factors that actually contribute to the changes of aquatic communities, and in this case, fish community populations, then throughout different scales, throughout the local scale, where we just look at the boundaries next to the stream, at the regional scale, and also at the catchment scale, statistical analysis always identify the same three factors that play a role. The first is the hydrological changes, which often result from introductions of dams into free-flowing river systems. And this is also the topic of the talk today, how hydropower, which is often associated with dam construction, how this affects biodiversity in stream ecosystems. The second factor is the land use effects, and especially the erosion-prone land use that introduces fine sediment into river systems. And the third one is actually urbanization, connections with industry, urban areas, and water treatment plants. So those are the factors that play a main role. But let's now look into hydropower. So for some people, hydropower is seen as a green energy due to its CO2 neutrality, and due to the fact also that it is very useful at times when there's no sun or no wind available. For other people, it is considered a red energy because of the damage that it does to aquatic ecosystems. And in more recent times, there have been some novel developments of hydropower technologies, which are referred to as innovative hydropower, or the people who produce these technologies often also sell them as fish-friendly hydropower. And we'll have a look how sustainable they really are when it comes to freshwater biodiversity. So we have large data sets on different types of hydropower use. In one project, we investigated how different innovative hydropower technologies actually work. This includes recent developments such as the very low head turbines, Archimedes screw turbines, the shaft power plant concept, and the movable power plant concept. So many different concepts which all promise to be more ecologically sustainable and less harmful to stream ecosystems. And we also looked at conventional hydropower plants and the different ways of how improvements work there, such as different types of fish screens, which are there to prevent the entry of fishes into the hydropower plant and into the turbine chamber itself. And we've also had some projects on fish protection facilities at diverse pumping stations. So in the talk today, I'll mostly focus on this comparison of innovative and conventional hydropower plants to ask the question, well, are those innovative solutions less harmful for the environment than conventional ones? And this has been a study where we focused on those different sites here. It's been a large-scale project where at each of those sites, we were out there in different seasons. We were able to do a before and after control impact design to look at the effects that those hydropower plants actually have. In terms of what we assessed, this on the one hand included analysis of the direct fish mortality at those plants. It also included an assessment of the injuries to fish populations. And we also looked at the corridor usage. So where do aquatic animals actually, which corridors do they use for the downstream passage? And then in the second part, we had an intensive investigation of the physical and chemical effects as well as the biological effects concerning the entire food webs. So in terms of these fish assessments, if you look at a hydropower plant, like you see it here on this upper area, we basically used nets to capture all the aquatic animals that actually pass through this power plant downstream to do an assessment on them. And this was based on the wild fish that migrate downstream, as well as on a large licensed animal experiment with those 8 fish species, which we released upstream and in different places of the hydropower plant to see what their injury patterns and what the mortality is. In addition, we also used a sonar system to look at fish behavior, and we also did sensor fish experiments in order to actually evaluate the physical forces such as shear stress, such as barotrauma, such as strikes that those fish face when they pass through these facilities. In terms of the ecological assessment, we did a systematic assessment upstream and downstream of the dams of those hydropower plants, where we looked at abiotic habitat characteristics such as the sediment composition, the physical-chemical properties of the water, the flow current, the water depth, and so on. And we also did a complete sampling of the entire food web, ranging from the algae, from the periphyton, to the macrophytes, to the macroinvertebrates, so the insect larvae and small worms and things like that, and also the fish populations. So let's look at the results. Well, as I said before, the expectation was that those innovative hydropower plants would cause very little damage to fish populations. That's at least what some of the producers of these technologies tell. The results were somehow different. So the dark gray bars, which you see here in the middle, that's the range of mean values across the fish populations that we investigated and across the different operational modes of those plants. And you can see that, on average, there's really no single technology out of those that we investigated that has a fish mortality on average that is below 5%. In some cases, in some species, and at some sites, we even see mortalities which are greater than 80%. Another interesting finding is that these innovative hydropower plant technologies did not necessarily cause a lower mortality compared to the conventional ones. And that, in other words, that the conventional technology, if equipped with some fish protection devices and so on, can actually also have a lower mortality compared to the innovative ones. We also did a thorough assessment on the injuries, and quite often injuries such as scale loss of the fishes, amputations, also internal damages, which you sometimes cannot recognize if you do not X-ray the fish, are also possible. And this can, again, have a serious impact on the fish populations and was quite substantial at those different sites that we investigated. Well, some people say this is all not so problematic because there are fish protection screens which are placed in front of the hydropower plants. But as a matter of fact, what we also saw with our investigations is that the majority of the fish, so 91% of our caught fish, and this is really large sample size of several 10,000s of fish, are smaller than 15 centimeters, and 97% are smaller than 20 centimeters. If we look at the bar spacing at those fish protection screens, then according to modeling approaches, only rather small fishes should fit through. But as a matter of fact, in our investigations, we saw that quite often double the size of fish than expected from the modeling results actually can move through these facilities. And especially for small growing species and for small fishes, these screens really provide very little protection to no protection. Only the very large specimens, this is something that we saw, they can actually get protected by those protection screens. In addition, we also looked at day, night, and seasonal patterns of fish movement, which would provide an interesting opportunity of managing the downstream passage of those populations, because what we found is that most fish populations really have a peak in their movement patterns downstream, which is associated, for instance, with spawning activities or with certain habitat shifts throughout their life cycle. But this is currently hardly used in the management of hydropower plants. And when it comes to the aquatic biodiversity overall and the aquatic community structures, what we saw is that there were quite pronounced differences between the upstream and the downstream areas of those dams. So water depth is typically increased in the upstream area, current velocity goes down, we have a greater amount of fine sediment, we have a lower oxygen concentration, especially in the stream bottom, which is crucial for many insect larvae, but also for the egg development of gravel spawning fishes. And in turn, what we saw throughout those sites is that the specialized and the current loving species, which are at the same time most endangered ones, actually have a decrease, and that generalist species are favored by those dams, especially in those upstream areas. What we also need to say, to be honest, here is that this is not primarily an effect of the hydropower, it is primarily an effect of the dam, which interrupts the river continuum. And if you have a river continuum, then you have, of course, a typical zonation, you have a movement of sediment throughout the system and so on. And if you build a dam, then you get a deposition of fine sediment in the upstream area, and quite often a habitat degradation, especially related to those highly specialized species, as I just demonstrated here. Well, I should also say that in this talk, I, of course, focused on the ecological effects and the conservation related effects of hydropower use. To have a more thorough assessment, it is at the same time also necessary to include technology assessments as well as socioeconomic assessments, especially when it comes to comparisons with other forms of energy provision. I should also say that in theory, it does make sense to look at single hydropower plants, but in reality, we quite often have a series of hydropower plants along river systems, and therefore we have to consider cumulative effects. And quite often, it is also really necessary to discuss those effects like we do in our projects together with the different stakeholders in order to get to improvements and in order to get to wise decisions in policy. Well, this already brings me to the key messages and to the conclusions of this talk. My first key message here is that the existing technologies of hydropower use can really result, as I demonstrated here, in substantial negative impacts on fishes and freshwater biodiversity. And this also holds true, at least for those that we investigated, for those technologies that claim to be fish-friendly, innovative, or ecologically sustainable. So a critical view is really useful here. Second key message is that given that some of these impacts are currently not really considered, or you could even say neglected, a critical and objective evaluation of the existing technologies is necessary, but we should also give a chance to the new developments, and there are new hydropower developments which also require a testing, and they deserve a chance, in my opinion. And the third and last key message here is that I think the concepts of freshwater biodiversity conservation, which quite often focus on other stresses, they also need to integrate this hydropower use more strongly in concert with those other stressors in order to be able to develop sustainable conservation strategies. And with this, I would like to thank our entire team. This has really been a team effort. At many of those sites, we were out with a team of 20 to 30 people. And I would also like to thank our funders, especially Bavarian State Ministry for the Environment, which funded this large project on innovative hydropower. And for those of you who are interested in the details, we have a series of peer-reviewed publications on this topic, on the different aspects, which I can send to you if you're interested. And there are also some publications that we produced on purpose in German so that the locals can also understand what the findings actually were. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was very exciting also for me that I'm not a freshwater biologist, in very integrated approach. Thanks very much for this exciting presentation. We move to Hannah Montag. She is a principal ecologist at Clarkson in Roots, where she works for over 10 years. More practical aspects. She works with ecological impact assessments and management plans, monitoring operational sites, so a very practical input to our conference. And it's very important that also Hannah has worked for publishing a best practice guidance to increase natural capital on solar farms, and so on. So we are very excited to listen to your case study, Jürgen. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the ecology of ground-mounted solar in the UK. My name is Hannah Montag, and I'm a principal consultant at Clarkson & Woods. We're a UK-based ecological consultancy, and I've been working on solar farms for over 10 years now. So I work on the ecological impact assessment side of things, but also supporting during construction and also carrying out post-construction monitoring and designing management plans for solar farms. So PV in the UK, the government has a strategy to increase solar from 14 gigawatts to 70 gigawatts by 2035. And of this, 50 gigawatts will be from ground-mounted solar arrays. So I did a rough calculation, and I estimate that this is around 1,000 kilometres squared of land. This is roughly 4 times the size of Frankfurt, so quite a large area taken over for solar development. As a background, back in 2019, the State of Nature report was published, and this was a real eye-opener in the UK. It set out the current state of wildlife, and some of the highlights were that 15% of species in the UK are threatened from extinction, and 133 have already gone extinct. So this is quite a dire situation. 72% of the land in the UK is managed for agriculture, and it's this intensification of agriculture that is primarily driving the reduction in species. So where do solar farms fit in with this? Well, we know that solar farms can help address the climate change, the climate crisis, but can they have a part to play in the biodiversity crisis as well? Well, removing land from intensive agricultural production can have a range of benefits. We're currently working with Lancaster University at the moment looking at soil health on solar farms and comparing this to adjacent agricultural land. And we are finding an increase in soil health, which can also help with flood alleviation and also water quality in the surrounding land. We're also finding as well that solar farms, if they're managed in the right way, can offer a resource for pollinators, which can obviously have ecosystem service impacts on surrounding agricultural land. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about biodiversity. So back in 2016, we carried out a study. It was a very small study. We looked at a small number of solar farms and compared these to adjacent control sites, which were still in agricultural production. And these are some of the headline results. So we found that plant diversity was higher on solar farms when compared with control sites. We also found that bird abundance was higher and also invertebrate abundance. We looked at bumblebees and butterflies on these solar farms. However, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to constructing and operating a solar farm. In the past, we had real problems with soil degradation during construction. You can see from this photo, a huge amount of soil damage occurring during construction on this site. And this really happens when these farms are constructed during wet weather. We also have a lot of sites that are intensively managed for agriculture, so usually sheep grazing, and where the intention is to sheep graze these sites, there are often little opportunities for biodiversity. And there are also challenges in terms of managing sites. So I showed a photo here of weed growth underneath panels where machinery can't get in to cut it. And then on another site where large-scale herbicide use is being carried out, and this obviously has impacts for local wildlife. And we're also finding impacts on birds as well. So here's a photo of skylark, lapwing and yellow wagtail. So these are all ground nesting bird species that have evolved to nest in open areas, usually of grassland, but in the UK they mainly nest within pasture fields and arable fields. And the construction of a solar array will displace these birds from nesting on sites. Because solar arrays are getting bigger and bigger in the UK, this impact is getting greater and greater. And more research really is needed in terms of what the actual impacts are and how we design mitigation for these kinds of species. These species are already struggling. These are red-listed species. But conversely, we have some positive stories as well. We put up barn owl boxes on a lot of our sites, and we're getting very high uptake in terms of barn owls, using them for roosting and nesting. And we record large numbers of other birds of prey on our sites as well. And we think it's the sort of unmanaged field boundaries where you get longer grassland, which is good for small mammals and so good for foraging for these species. And it's worth mentioning other impacts as well. There have been some studies coming out of Hungary and the USA looking at aquatic invertebrates and how they may mistake solar panels for expanses of water. There is some recent research that should be published in the next year, which looks at this in more depth and in terms of how this actually relates to solar farms. And there are also studies looking at bats and how bats perceive solar panels and smooth surfaces. Again, there's more research coming out from the UK and also from Hungary looking at this in more depth. So I think these are areas to really keep an eye on. There's a study that came out of Lancaster University this year that looked at pollinators, and they found that solar farms have higher numbers, when they're managed in the right way, have higher numbers of bumblebees. And obviously this can have an effect on surrounding agricultural land by increasing pollination. So I just wanted to go through some of the success stories. These are some of the sites that we monitor. And we have several sites where wildflower meadows have successfully been created. And this habitat is so wildflower meadows have declined by 98% in the UK. This is a really, really important habitat, and it supports a range of wildlife. So it's really good to see that this can successfully be created. We also have sites where wetland areas have been established, so where swales or ditches have been incorporated within the solar array, and this shows a nice botanical diversity relating to that, and also lakes and ponds created outside of the solar array. And we have a lot of tree and hedgerow planting going on as well. A lot of this is for screening purposes, so hedgerow and tree planting to screen the solar array development from adjacent roads or housing developments. But these lengths of tree and hedgerow planting create a really nice habitat corridor and connect up the local landscape. And we have sites where planting occurs outside of the actual solar farm itself. So here we've got some nice wildflower margins that have been sown, and also an orchard, which has community benefits as well. However, most of the sites that we monitor look like this. So they look like golf courses. They're heavily managed either through grazing or regular cutting, and they have very low amounts of diversity in terms of plants and also other wildlife. So there are huge opportunities being missed on these sites. So as mentioned, we have recently published this document. So this is best practice guidance, and the aim is to look at how to increase biodiversity at all stages of a solar farm development. So that's from site selection through to design, construction, operation, and finally decommissioning. And we've created this best practice guidance alongside academics and also industry. And it's been really interesting because we've been contacted by solar operators in other countries as well. So a company in Hungary has just produced a best practice guidance relating to Hungary. And we're also working with a Greek solar farm developer as well, looking at how they can increase biodiversity on their Greek sites. And we've produced a standardized approach to monitoring ecology on solar farms. And our hope is that this can be rolled out to other consultancies in the UK. And we can be all collecting more and more standardized data, so we can look at a larger data set and look at the current trends, some of the problems that are happening on solar farms. So I'm just going to show some highlights from our monitoring work. We categorise sites in terms of how they're managed. So sites with under category 1 are managed for wildlife, And then that's a sliding scale down to category 3, which are sites that are managed for agriculture, usually through sheep grazing. And you can clearly see that the grassland diversity is significantly higher on sites where there is a focus on wildlife. However, only 4 of the 62 sites that we included in this study were actually managed for wildlife. So again, as I said, there are huge opportunities being missed. So I just wanted to briefly mention this. Last year, the Environment Act came into legislation, which requires a 10% biodiversity net gain for all developments in the UK. So I put in some rough calculations here, but solar farms have a lot of opportunities for habitat creation. So for example, if you have a solar farm where you're creating 100 habitat units, you only need 20 of these for your biodiversity net gain during planning, which leaves 80 units potentially to be traded. So we have estimated that one habitat unit may be worth something like 11,500 euros. So by trading those 80 credits, you could be getting an income of 920,000 euros. So this is a really good income that can help solar farm operators to implement some of these biodiversity enhancements. So for example, seeding of wildflower mixes or using specialized machinery to cut sites and collect arisings. I'm not quite sure how I feel about this because obviously this is trading. So my worry is that we're going to end up with lots of housing developments with very little greenery, and all that green space will be put onto a solar farm where, you know, we have no public access. And I also wanted to mention community benefits. So we work quite a lot on community-owned solar farms, and I think this is a really exciting aspect because where there's less emphasis on profit, there are more opportunities to add in biodiversity features. And there are also some projects looking at bringing local communities in and getting them more involved. I think just giving them more of a sense of ownership of these sites. So we work with a company called Earth Energy Education that bring in local schools and teach them about renewable energy and also teach them about biodiversity. So this is a bunch of school children learning about solar farms, but also doing an invertebrate survey. So in conclusion, solar farms can obviously address the climate crisis, but they can have a part to play in the biodiversity crisis as well. However, the right management is needed, and at the moment, this is not happening on the majority of sites. And so I think we need more mechanisms to ensure that these sites are managed in the right way and these biodiversity enhancements are realised. And more research is needed. We're starting to see more and more collaboration with other countries within the UK and also collaboration with academia and industry. And I think this is a really exciting aspect, and I hope to see more of this. My contact details, I'd love to hear more about solar PV in other European countries, so feel free to email me. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Hannah. It was a very interesting presentation and also some note of optimism that you contributed to our conference. So thank you very much. So, Chris?
Yeah, I think we have heard 4 absolutely interesting, excellent presentations that set us up for a lively discussion now about the green-green conflict and also the possible solutions. So actually, at this point, I would like to invite all the speakers to join us here. We would like to see all of you. Let's see how we fit on the screen. And also to get us started a little bit, we have prepared a question for the Mentimeter. And I would like to ask our supporters to post this so that people can help us with that question. So maybe Vassiliki, want to introduce that question, the background of it to the people so that they know. It's again your mic. Vassiliki, your mic is not working.
Okay.
Now, again.
Now it's problem fixed. Good. So, because we all speak about these issues of the fast development of the of wind, of not for renewable infrastructure. We have this the new law that's going to be applied, the Repower Plan. This is a strategy about the fast development, and the idea is that we should have dedicated go-to areas that renewables should be very fast constructed there because we need them really. But there will be no environmental assessment about the environmental impacts in these areas because we need to have them fast. This is the idea of the go-to areas in the forthcoming legislation in Europe, and also it might be that all renewables are going to be considered as infrastructures of overriding public interest, because this is the legal frame that allows for not really respecting all environmental strict legislation to have them fast. This is a small introduction about it. So I don't know how the final question is formulated. The idea is if we agree with this or not, because it's really a very tricky decision and very tricky question.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to hear about the dilemma and how you feel about this. Since we all, most of us have a biodiversity background, I think the null expectation for the result is not 50-50. But I think let's see how we end up with the results here. So while you're still typing, I think I would like to, as the only person here who has not given a talk today, I would like to pose a question to the four speakers. So we are obviously in a Nexus session. That means also two spheres meet. And these two spheres have to meet because joint solutions are required. So you have mostly a background in ecology, but to solve your problems, you have to speak with engineers, energy companies, and business people. What are your experiences, and what are the challenges in these interactions? But maybe what are also positive surprises that you have experienced? Maybe I start in the sequence of the speakers of today. Vassiliki. Again, the microphone.
Okay. So to be honest, it's not so much culture communication between academics and business. And also it's not much culture in my country that academics, they do applied research. So it was a quite a surprise that we did as a lab all this applied research, also leading to legislation. And I was not conducted at all by the business sector, not even to talk, not even to have a common round table or something. It was like the first time that the scientists said something applied that impacts our interest, or the spatial planning is a very hot issue. So let's pretend that it doesn't exist. So I'm not a good introductory person to tell you my experience because I have no experience.
Okay. So there's a lack of communication.
It's very interesting to see what the other colleagues they experience.
Yeah. Finn, what about you?
Yeah, thank you. So I think from my experience, often it's said that companies operating the wind turbines are on the opposite, so at the other end of the gradient of I don't know. So that nature conservation, climate change, or these companies are often at opposite ends of the discussion, but more or less enemies. But I don't think that this is really true. Many of them are also interested in saving biodiversity. Maybe many more say so, but I think some of them, or many of them, are also really willing to do so. But of course they have different perspectives and want to interest in making money. So that makes then the conversation very, very difficult. But I wouldn't say, for example, that there's no chance of aligning climate goals and biodiversity goals in practice. I think there's a huge opportunity, but of course there needs to be some knowledge transfer and trust building among stakeholders. But it's always a hard job.
Okay, thanks. Jürgen, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think what is really crucial, first of all, that as scientists we take a neutral role. That that we don't get into the one or the other position too strongly, but that we try to be objective, describing the findings, and that we also try to be as transparent as possible. So with our hydropower projects, this is, of course, you asked about the challenges, and of course, if you developed a new technology where you say this is fish friendly, and then some people find it is not, you're of course losing money. These are not going to be your best friends. But from my experience, what we did throughout this project was that in the beginning, we decided on a very clear communication strategy. And this communication strategy turned out to be very successful. And it worked in the way that we said, okay, we need to have the consent of the different stakeholders when we go to certain sites to do the investigations. So the developers, the power plant owners at the sites, the fishing clubs, the nature conservation people, the water boards, they all have to agree that we do these investigations. And I also said initially, we are not going to determine which sites we will investigate. So if someone decided to sue one of those sites and to say, well, we don't want to build a power plant there, then we said, that's fine. We don't mind doing the pre-investigations, even if it's not going to be realized. So that was, I think, an important key. And then what I also noticed is, like Finn already said, knowledge transfer is important. So in many cases, there was a situation that the engineers or hydropower people and the local fishing clubs and nature conservation people, they were only talking to each other by lawyers. But we had this communication strategy that we said, before we are going to publish this in international papers like we did, we will spend at least one, if not two entire days to just talk with the local people, to present our results and to have an open discussion about this, before having and without having the national lobbying groups and so on involved, to just talk with the people that are directly affected. And in many cases, this showed us we could find solutions. So it's probably not enough time to go into concrete examples, but there was one example about eel migration, where there were just two very, very conflicting views, and where people said all the power plants have to install a certain technique. They were, of course, completely against it because it was too expensive. By our investigations, we found that this proposed technique would not have worked. Not a single eel used it. We've instead found that a different solution, which was actually cheaper, worked, and a joint agreement could be reached. And I think this is the way how we have to work. I don't want to say that there are no remaining conflicts, but this is at least the role that we can take as scientists to get progress.
Yeah, thank you, Jürgen. I mean, I just wanted to say to all the scientists who are in this room here, what you just said is slowing down the publication process in order to invest in communication with stakeholders. Just to emphasize this. Very cool. Thank you. Hannah, what about you?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I think, from my perspective, things have changed a lot over the last 10 years. We were originally, 10 years ago, just brought in to get a planning application through, and whatever they needed to do in terms of ecology, they just did. But now we're getting much more engagement. So I think companies have environmental and social governance targets. And so we're actually actively being asked now to go to some operational sites and look at ways that they can enhance these sites for biodiversity. And that's just off their own backs. And also what you say about knowledge transfer is interesting too. We're working at the moment, I feel like we're kind of bridging that gap a little bit between industry and academia. We're working on a project at the moment. It's called a knowledge transfer partnership. And we've identified where there is gaps in our knowledge in terms of how solar farms interact with the environment. And we're partnering up with a university to then conduct some studies, trying to sort of pick this apart a little bit more. So I've got quite a positive aspect on all of this, I think, from my point of view.
So how about the Mentimeter? But Vassiliki, please.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was negative at the beginning by saying that directly with the business sector, it was not a contact, okay, because we don't have yet this culture. But I fully agree with everything you have said. And I would like to give a general advice, let's say, from my experience, two things. First, socialized science, as you say, slow down publication process, but give a lot of communication. So this is something we did also by providing a 10-page, very popular science text about what we found. That has a huge social impact, so it's very nice. And second issue, as also Jürgen had said, academic neutrality. So I never gave interviews, media, TVs. It was a huge publicity, but I had to be very academic, very neutral, because it was politicized. You understand, from the different political parties, they would like to use me as a vitrina for whatever. So you have also to be very careful not to provide interviews in different journals, whatever, for different political parties. So you have to be really very good nerves to stay calm and so on.
That certainly helps. So by the time we have the results of our survey, and when I thought about this together with Vassiliki, I felt that if there was more than 10% answering this with yes and not sure, then this is a significant result. So there is obviously people amongst us who are not so entirely sure about the priorities here, and I can really understand this and also relate to this. At the same time, we have really a lot of very interesting questions in the chat. And maybe, Vassiliki, would you like to go through the first set and pick some related to the wind farm issues and lead this, and then I will take over for the other topics.
So we're going to exchange a little bit about the different sectors of energy. So the first question comes from Johannes Meka, and it goes to our second speaker, to Phil. Can you read it also? Does the placement of wind turbines in human influenced areas imply the assumption that degraded habitats will not or never recover or be restored? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, one must, of course, say that we are already living in a fragmented landscape. So not so our forests aren't untouched in this sense. So old growth forests that are really untouched have become rare in Europe, and maybe there are minor forests in Poland, for example, where I did my PhD, and a few more, but the number are very small. And so there are almost no untouched forests in Europe, as you know. And so maybe our aim then should be to have healthy forests, of course, with a high quality for people and biodiversity. And here I would say that any wind turbine is similar to the effects of roads. So first of all, it is a disturbance. But there might be, of course, possibilities how we can decrease the impact of wind turbines on the environment. For example, but due to good spatial planning before, or implementing curtailments or things like this, and this will then help that the effect will be small. Yeah, this is what I would say.
Okay.
Maybe we should mix it a bit.
You should go on.
I think there is one question to Hannah that I would like to read. And it says, is sheep grazing diversity-wise better in non-solar power plant sites? So keeping the sheep out of it or having them in? What is your best practice on this?
Yeah, we're looking through our botanical data at the moment to examine that in more detail. But generally, what we find is sheep graze sites have lower diversity grassland. I think the issue is that with a lot of our management plans, we state that conservation grazing will be applied, so low density sheep grazing. But But in practice, that never happens. I think it's very difficult to get shepherds to put the right stocking densities on or take the sheep off during the summer. So it very rarely happens in practice. So we generally recommend cutting, but the issue with this is that getting the machinery in to cut between panels and then remove the arisings as well, because obviously these are highly fertile fields. And so you want to be taking the grassland off in order to create a wildflower meadow. But there just really isn't the machinery to be able to do this, and it's hugely expensive. And also there's problems in terms of the arisings, what you do with them. We have one site where the arisings are being taken away by a waste company because no one wants late cut grass. It's not good for silage or haylage or that kind of thing. So it's definitely an issue.
Yes, thanks for answering this really in depth. I hand over to Vassiliki again.
Okay, so the second question comes from Professor Ben. I cannot spell it really. It's Hans Jürgen.
Hans Jürgens.
Good. So the question, I'm sorry, Bernd, this I can tell. Should we generally, this is also goes for you, Finn, so you are very popular. Should we generally exclude wind turbines in forest, even if these forests are totally destroyed by calamity? And if no reforestation is possible due to climate change impacts, so for zones should be exclusion zones?
I wouldn't suggest. I mean, it doesn't really matter where we put wind turbines; they will lead to some kind of disturbance in the environment anyway. So it's not really a question if we shall not put them in forests. So I would say it is possible to align it, but yeah, as I already said, it's really important to implement the right measures to reduce the effects of wind turbines on the environment. And you said it already, spatial planning is key. Curtailment measures can be very helpful. Improving compensation measures is one more step. And another step could be that we need to update old wind turbines. So we have in Germany, we have produced many old constructed old wind turbines in potentially harmful environments, and there are numbers for collisions in one federal district in Germany that shows that the numbers of collisions at these old wind turbines are 2 times higher than at the new constructed wind turbines. So I think it's really up to improving the measures of aligning climate goals and biodiversity goals. But I think it's possible. So no, we shouldn't put our head into the sand. And and if no reforestation is possible due to climate change impacts, then I would say then we planted the wrong trees. But that's not an issue of wind turbines.
Okay, I would have a question from Philipp Sprenger from FEDA to Jürgen. How do species trends in Bavaria differ between the Danube system with many endemic species as opposed to other river systems? So how can you generalize from your studies in Bavaria?
Yeah, this is also a very good question. And the answer is that these general trends are the same. So whenever you have this damming in river systems, the structural modifications, when you have this hydropower use, then it is typically in all places worldwide, you have different species, assemblages, of course. So the species are not exactly the same, but the same features of those species are affected. So this is mostly those species that need high current, so that need a flow current. It is the long distance migrating species, or generally species that need to have habitat shifts for different phases in their life cycle. And that's also what we see reflected in the red lists. Those are the species which are at the brink of extinction. And maybe also a connection of this. So this is the same pattern that we see throughout, even if the specific species carry different names and are slightly different. Yeah, but I mean, one question that was also there, and this relates to, should we have more solar, hydro, or wind? In terms of the hydro, what we can say that there is, at least in the industrialized countries already, most of the useful parts of hydropower have already been exploited. So if we think about, can we expand it further, then this refers to river systems like in the Balkans or in large river systems globally, which have not yet been used for hydropower use, where we still have some of these highly vulnerable species present. And when it comes to further expansion, then in my opinion, this is only possible and only useful if we keep the very, very few areas where we still have intact freshwater systems out of this development. And if we instead invest in modernization, like Finn also mentioned for the wind turbines, in modernization and so on, because those investments typically then last for a very long time. If you build a hydropower facility and if you build a turbine, then you calculate that it stays there for at least 30 to 50 years.
Okay, I'm very glad you say so, because in the Balkans, we still have really free-flowing large rivers with a lot of freshwater biodiversity. And that would be my question, but you just said that some areas also in rivers that they are intact, maybe it's not a good idea. I mean, technologies are very nice, but if we place them in already disturbed systems, it's better. So I'm sorry, I'm going to answer a question that I think it goes for me. It's from Dr. Gisela Oschinger. What is the influence of the wind turbines themselves, and what the influence of the larger roads, isn't it? So I did not present here all the detailed results because it's going to be published afterwards. Within the polygons, within the installation polygons, the greatest part of land that it's taken is by the plateaus of the cement plateaus of the wind turbines. And it's more the contribution of roads that they just connect the plateaus between them. But outside the polygon, it's mainly access roads. So I don't recall exactly the proportions, but for the within and outside the polygon. But of course, we do have all the data exactly on which type of artificial land we say. I would like just to say a small comment in this general question is that it is quite different, because in some countries, like in the Balkan areas, in Eastern Europe, in Greece, that we have a lot of nice intact mountains, we have a lot of endemism, plants, insects especially. So by constructing any type of construction, could be ski center or tourist infrastructure or wind farms or whatever, means habitat loss. And for some cases, that means a complete global extinction of species, because they are very endemics and they have a niche exactly in the top of one mountain. If we plant any infrastructure there of any type, we lose the species globally. So that's why we're quite anxious in the country about the spatial planning needed. Okay. So it's about
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left for the session. There is one interesting question from Birte Hauser, which is about the recommendation for biodiversity science. And I would again like to ask all of the four of you for a very brief answer. So, if I was a funding agency and I would give you 5 million euro, let's say 10 million, what would you do? 2 sentences. Let's start with Vassiliki first. Same sequence.
Okay, so how much money I have? Good.
10 million.
For me, it's quite simple. I mean, first is economize energy. It's ridiculous. I mean, we have like a barrel that it's empty. I speak about the building sector and so on, and we try to fill it with water by damaging nature. And first, we have to have a barrel that it's not without hollows. So for me, it would be economy and in the energy sector, in buildings, transport, and all this. This is the main transition. Then for me, would be solar panels on the roofs. But I'm not sure, I don't know from the engineer point of view, if we do have the material, I don't know about this, if it's possible. But I know that there are some studies, for instance, in Crete, if you just plant these roof panels in 50% of the houses in 3 big cities, we cover everything. It's really underestimated, and then the others.
Thank you. Actually, this was also already my second question, because I had another round for your top wish to the politicians, to the society. So for the science part, Finn, what would you do with 10 million?
So as for science, then I would invest in similar maps as Professor Kati is creating, and especially working on, I think this would be very nice to have a synergy between all those different renewable energies and see what are the to-go areas for the different energy sources at the European scale, for example. This would be very cool. And then one could see priority areas for different energy sources and can give direct recommendations for where we would invest or construct which type of energy. And then we could also coordinate this among nations. So maybe some nations are better suited for solar energy and others are better suited for wind energy. And for example, we now have a problem that close to the Black Sea, there are constructed many wind turbines, and in an area where many birds are migrating, this is maybe not the best solution. Yeah, we could better coordinate than those things.
Okay, thanks, Finn. We only have 2 minutes left now, so I need really short answers. Jürgen?
I'm sorry.
Yes. Okay, I would spend half of the money or part of the money on really creating these maps of prioritization, considering the different forms of energy at the same time. Yeah, that would be one part, and I would invest the other part into investigate. I would spend it on hydropower research, and I would say there are still many more new developments, new technologies that have not been tested, and we already have the methodology to do that. And I would simply integrate other ones to identify the best possible ones, or the ones that have the lowest impact. And also, I would invest in doing research on how the operational modes of these facilities and so on, can still be optimized.
We'll have to hire engineers too. Hannah, what about you?
So half of mine would go into developing more community-owned, small-scale community-owned solar projects. And then in terms of research, I'd like to see more research in terms of soil health and also invertebrates. I think it's a very little understood area, and obviously it's having a huge impact with the pollinator decline and general invertebrate decline at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we will be kicked out, I think, in a minute. We don't have time for further questions. Let me thank all the speakers for the excellent contributions and also the very instructive answers, and also the audience for a lively discussion and really brilliant questions. Thanks so much, and hope to see you all soon.